Hey, welcome anybody who showed up early. I'm just cleaning up. We had a show on Saturday and I've got a lot of stuff to put away. But I've been really delinquent on these shows lately. A lot of stuff going on with the software side of things, and it's not as easy to get guests lately. Because of the latest demonetization thing, there's a lot of people who are really scrambling for all their time. So there's really not much time for a lot of these content creators to hang out. But let's get going. All right, welcome to evidence-based audio number 219, and this is replication crisis. All right, so it's gonna be a little tricky because it's hard not to get into politics, but it's not really one-sided, and it's also hard to avoid subjects that YouTube and Google and Facebook won't censor or strike you for. YouTube and Facebook are notoriously anti-science. And we did a show a couple weeks ago about, they will happily censor science pages, science websites, science articles. But if you want to make pseudoscience claims about fake crystal health scams or, magic beans or magic prostate medicine or whatever, YouTube and Facebook are perfectly happy to run it. They virtue signal about being good guys, and they're out there trying to protect you, while they are perfectly happy to take the money of scam artists who will actually hurt you. People who are trying to take your money knowing that their products can't work. They've been proven not to work. And Facebook and YouTube and Google are perfectly okay with that. But, talk about any real science subject and you are facing a copyright strike or a community guideline strike, terms of service strike. So this is tricky, but this one's, I'm calling it the replication crisis. And you guys hear me harp on all the time about statistically significant, peer-reviewed, hopefully placebo-controlled and hopefully properly blinded studies as the gold standard when, you're making claims, like when these guys make claims about tone wood or mic preamps sounding different or whatever. But just because it makes it through peer review doesn't necessarily mean that that you can take it to the bank, let's say. So there's something called the replication crisis going on, and this is tricky. It's been going on for quite a while, actually. The latest version, I think, is they're calling it the replication crisis. And I'm going to read the Wikipedia part of it, but Wikipedia is extremely biased towards the type of people who actually caused the replication crisis. And but even then, it's okay. Let's read it this way. Okay. And let me make sure we're getting audio. Yes, we are. Okay. So there, Wikipedia says the replication crisis, also called the replicability crisis and the reproducibility crisis, is an ongoing methodological crisis in which the results of many scientific studies are difficult or impossible to reproduce. Because the reproducibility of empirical results is an essential part of the scientific method, such failures undermine the credibility of theories building on them and potentially call into question substantial parts of scientific knowledge. Okay, it's not... See, now this is why I'm saying Wikipedia, it's a little bit dicey. It's not that they're difficult or impossible to reproduce. Many of these have obvious fraud in them. Many of these have obvious errors in them. And somehow they all make it through peer review. And I'm going to talk more about that. The reason that this is making it through peer review, and I know this is this is hard to say neutrally, but let's just say it. What we call soft sciences or social sciences have become the gatekeeper for hard sciences in academia. There is, and don't take my word for it, go check this yourself. There is most definitely one ideological viewpoint when it comes to academia in general. If you're talking about any of the Ivy League schools, any of the prestigious colleges, whatever, there is precisely and only one viewpoint allowed in general. And you guys can argue over what that is. I would love to see. The thing with me is that particular viewpoint often lines up on the side of reality. So, it doesn't seem so bad from the outside, but anything that does call their dogma into question could be suppressed. It may not get the fair shake that it should. Things that do support their dogmas have an easier time getting through gates that they shouldn't get through, for instance. And this is really hard to say neutrally, but I think unless you're really, honestly, what you call a useful idiot, you kind of know this is true. And there's a bajillion studies out there that'll prove it. There's no question about that. So if you align, and sadly, it's politically, honestly, if you align politically with the views of the current regime, it's easier to get through gates that are very difficult to get through if you don't subscribe to this dogma. And you may get mad to call it a dogma, but I like Aaron Ra's definition of faith is that, something that you believe in without evidence, but often in spite of the existing evidence. Then, I think it's fair to call things a dogma. So anyway, I've seen numbers thrown around that something like 75% of these papers either have never been reproduced, have grievous errors, or grievous fraud, outright fraud in them. And sometimes you see that they call the appeal to authority, right? And this is kind of why, because you can't, just because it's peer reviewed, sadly, doesn't mean you can trust it. There's tons of fake journals out there. I had I was talking to my cousin one time, but wouldn't it be nice to make an online journal where all you do is reproduce other studies? And it sounds stupid, and nobody ever wants to go through and actually prove that they did the study correctly. But I really think that if you had just a journal of replication where you see the experiment, the science somebody did, and you do it yourself again, not only is that fun, that'd be really educational, and I could see a lot of classes where that would help. It would really clean up this science here. So I'll go on in the Wikipedia just a little bit. It says the replication crisis is frequently discussed in relation to psychology and medicine. Okay. I don't know if you know, let me just type this in, APA style. So there's something called the APA style. It's how you write. It's how you're supposed to write scientific papers. And again, this is politics and ideology getting in the way of science. Let me see if somebody explains. If somebody talks about what exactly APA style is. So it's from the American Psychological Association, and right off the bat, that should tell you something. And look, psychology, I know it can be a science. It often isn't, but let's look at the Wikipedia one. I'm not sure if this is gonna be right. And you notice there's some red flags already on this Wikipedia article. But it says APA style, also known as APA format, is a writing style and format for academic documents such as scholarly journals articles, and books. It is commonly used for citing sources within the field of behavioral and social sciences. If it stayed there, fine, because honestly, those so often nowadays are not sciences. Sorry, but they're not. Including sociology, education, health sciences. Now, health science is not a social science. Health is science. Criminal justice and anthropology, as well as psychology. It is described in the Style Guide of American Psychological Association, which is titled the Publication Manual of American Psychological Association. The guidelines were developed to aid reading comprehension in the social and behavioral sciences for clarity of communication and here's a direct quote, for word choice that best reduces bias in language. But now APA style is being used for science papers. That's a problem. When they talk about bias in language, let's see how honest this is. Because when they're saying bias free, they don't mean bias free. They mean they don't want certain flavors of bias in there, and they definitely want other flavors of bias. I know this is starting to sound like conspiracy kook territory, but you can imagine if you have a certain color glasses, there's a lot of things that you're not going to see, and a lot of things that you're not going to see correctly. So here's bias-free communication is a speech or writing that attempts to include people of all ethnicities, gender identities, sexual orientations, religious affiliations, abilities, and ages by communicating in a way that makes no assumptions about the receiver of such communication. Now that sounds good, but that's not how it comes out in practice, is it? There's a lot of words you're not allowed to use, and who censors the censors? Who watches the watchers? Like, who decides what's what? So in this identifying bias part, if verbal or written communication includes any of the following, it may be bias. Right? Maybe, I don't care about maybe, but let's look at this. Unsupported claims. Yes, let's call those out. That's important. You don't need some hokey doke ideology in order to say that. You just want to find the truth. Best thing to do is make sure you don't get any unsupported claims. Extreme or inappropriate language. All right, we are way off the rails already. What? Who decides what's inappropriate? Who decides what's extreme? This is bias. So, like when I said, this is not for bias free. This is for bias full. They want a certain bias. Spoken communication may have a speaker with a poor reputation. Like, are you serious? Okay, so you know how hokey doke this is already. So let's get out of here. So, once upon a time, replication had been called the cornerstone of science. Somebody does a experiment and you reproduce it. Hey, I can take that to the bank. So Stephen Schmidt said this, replication is one of the central issues in any empirical science. To confirm results or hypotheses by a repetition procedure is at the basis of any scientific conception. A replication experiment to demonstrate that the same findings can be obtained in any other place by any other researcher is conceived as an operationalization of objectivity. It is the proof that the experiment reflects knowledge that can be separated from the specific circumstances, such as time, place, or persons under which it was gained. Replication is important. If somebody's making cold fusion and nobody else can make it work, see Pons and Fleischmann, what good is that alleged science, right? It's hard for me because I watch kids whose parents absolutely destroy themselves economically to put them into these college, hopefully get them into a college where the price is just astronomical. But we don't even have to talk about how much, with AI and everything, a lot of these jobs are not going to exist. But these kids come out of school in debt, in so much debt more than their parents may have made in their entire lives for jobs that probably don't exist. And the saddest part about this is that up to 3/4 of the classes that you are forced to take if you want this degree have nothing to do with your degree, and often can be counter to your degree. If you have anti-science classes as a requirement and you're in a science field, you're being forced to pay to undo your own education. It's really disgusting. And I know, like, there's people who will make an argument that this is so that you can have well-rounded students come out. But if you're only doing something from one particular bias, I don't know how well-rounded you're going to be anyway. Well, just let them take the science. And this is why, as much as they were frowned upon not so long ago, I think trade schools are really starting to take off, because look, they're targeting education for education's sake, not for some ideology's sake, not for a religion's sake, not for a bias's sake, not for a political view's sake. They're just biasing education for education. So anyway, that's the replication crisis in a nutshell. You may have, I don't know if I can even show this word, but there was a guy named Andrew Wakefield, and he got his nonsense, obvious garbage and gobbledygook pushed through the British science journal, The Lancet. And it's just really hard to say because of how Google censors science and how Facebook will censor science, if they haven't blocked us already just for having that V word on. This guy claimed that taking shots to prevent disease caused autism. And this is still believed. Like, I live in Hawaii, okay? Here in Hawaii, people still believe this. And they post it every day on Instagram, Facebook, and everything else. Again, Facebook won't take that off, but when we talk about pro-science stuff, they'll ban us for it. This is still causing major trouble. There are piles of areas. I talk about Maui right here in Hawaii, for instance. There's parts of Texas, parts of California, where this belief is still so prevalent that they don't immunize their kids against measles, mumps, rubella, whooping cough, polio. It's terrifying. I can't even say the Backstreet Boys reunion tour thing because, again, these censors will get me, even though they let these schmucks run around and keep doing this stuff. So this was a case of where you absolutely, positively, 1 billion%, because the health of the entire world is at stake, need to replicate these findings. If they were true, and if they were false, you had to get rid of this thing immediately. This never should have been published. I take a lot of crap because I look at the Lancet. I know it's just one mistake, but it's a huge mistake. And I don't think the Lancet should be taken seriously unless they've proved that they are doing something to make sure this never happens again. This is horrible. So this is why we want to see something like this replication crisis. I know you guys think, what does this have to do with audio? To me, it has everything to do with audio. We need to have beliefs and claims in our industry that line up with the facts. When you go and tell some new kid that he can't use a certain pickup in his guitar because it's made out of mahogany, you better be able to back that up. And spoiler alert, you've got zero, not even primary studies that would back you up. You've got no replications at all, okay? And the idea that science should be done by feelings or by ideology or by bias or by politics, it's why so many of these beliefs still run around. When people think that when a DAW completely nulls, that somehow it has a sound. No, it has no sound. Anyway, so there was something called the Sokol Affair. Again, this is Wikipedia, who is the target of attacks by Alan Sokol, because Wikipedia does push this ideology. So, but I'll read you the Wikipedia version just so you know. So it says the so-called affair, also called the so-called hoax, was a demonstrative scholarly hoax performed by Alan Sokal, a physics professor at New York University and University College London. Yes, that's NYU. So there you go. In 1996, Sokal submitted an article to the Social Text, an academic journal of cultural studies. The submission was an experiment to test the journal's intellectual rigor, specifically to investigate whether a leading North American journal of cultural studies, whose editorial collective includes such luminaries as Frederick Jameson and Andrew Ross, would publish an article liberally salted with nonsense if A, it sounded good, and B, it flattered the editor's ideological preconceptions, or it flatters the editor's ideological bias. The article, Transgressing the Boundaries Towards a Transformative Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity, was published in the journal Spring-Summer 1996 Science Wars issue. It proposed that quantum gravity is a social and linguistic concept. How many times have you heard blah, blah, blah is a social concept or a social construct? The journal did not practice academic peer review, and it did not submit the article for outside expert review by a physicist. 3 weeks after its publication in May 1996, Sokal reviewed in the magazine Lingua Franca that the article was a hoax. So basically, he made an article about gravity, which was more about like social theory, probably like gender and race and whatever. And because it had the right words in it, it got published. Let's see, and there was another, we're going to talk about later on versions of this, but basically it's postmodernism has leaked into a lot of this. So it's easy to make accusations of scientism or whatever. But instead of these colleges and these academic institutions saying, hey, wow, we screwed up. Thank you for pointing out how we screwed up. We're going to fix this. This is never going to happen again. No. They attack the whistleblowers, which is why we have whistleblower protection laws. But, so let's see. The hoax caused controversy about the scholarly merit of commentary on the physical sciences by those in the humanities, the influence of postmodern philosophy on social disciplines in general, and academic ethics, including whether Sokal was wrong to deceive the editors of the readers of social text. He wasn't wrong. Get out of here. This is like, hey, you shouldn't have caught me stealing your cookies. It's just because I stole the cookies doesn't mean you should have busted me for it. And whether social text had abided by proper scientific ethics. In 2008, Sokal published Beyond the Hoax, which revisited the history of hoax and discusses lasting implications, or whatever. You may have heard of feminine glaciology. Glaciers, Gender, and Science, a Feminist Glaciology Framework for Global Environmental Change Research. I mean, this is why, again, don't put the humanities, the social sciences, and whatever in charge of science. They don't care about that stuff. That stuff is about feelings. And, there's no reason not to have classes about feelings, but they should not decide whether or not reality is reality. This is to the point where people are saying like 2 + 2 = 4 is a gender or social construct or racism or something. We've heard how many times algebra is colonialism, right? Calculus is the colonial mindset. You hear stuff like Western science or Western medicine, then you're talking to an idiot. You got no business talking about scientific papers. This stuff is absolutely bonkers. So one of the funniest cases is where people took Mein Kampf, Hitler's manifesto, basically changed it to social science type words, and replaced some of the good guys and bad guys with names that were more appealing to the reviewer. Mein Kampf. And it got published and it got praised. Like, that's how bad this stuff is. There's an organization, I think they changed their name recently, but it used to be called Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, it's the fire.org, that is to protect you in school. If your individual rights are getting violated, but a lot of times it is that science researchers can't do their science studies because the social science, I hate to say social science, the socialismists, but it's not socialism. The social science people, oh my God, see, I can't say it. Social studies people, how about that? The soft sciences, the pseudosciences, they're in charge of stuff. So you may not even, you got to get past your institutional review board, which used to say, hey, is this thing safe, or are you going to kill a bunch of people that you're doing the study on? Now it's more about, is this diversity inclusive or whatever? It's nothing to do with science. And the fire exists out there. I think they changed their name to something else. Let's see, Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. Okay, that's what they are now. It used to be Foundation for Individual Rights and Education. But they say free speech makes free people. The funny part about this organization, and this is why we're here, when they first started, this was it was a organization to fight back then what they called right-wing censorship. And I think they were involved in Berkeley when Berkeley used to be the home of free speech. Imagine that, how different it is now, right? Berkeley, you are absolutely not allowed free speech anymore. But back then, this was something they were fighting for, and they were fighting hard for. And so when they started this organization, that's who the enemy was. Nowadays, their main enemy seems to be the other side of the political aisle. But, either way, this, free speech is, especially in science, you need to be able to think, say, experiment however you need in order to find out the truth. The truth is not about feelings, so it's, the fire is out there if you need their help. We've had something called the grievance studies, and this, I can't even bother to read the Wikipedia version of this because it is absolute garbage. This is the father of modern epistemology, Peter Boghossian. He is one of the characters in this. They did a kind of a modern so-called studies thing to look at just how bad college culture has become in bias and again, how they keep putting stuff through peer review that has no place getting past anything. And I think one of them was like they made a paper that said it's written by his cat or whatever. There's a whole bunch of nonsense, but this is Peter Boghossian. This is the guy. If you know what street epistemology is, let's just type that in. This is the guy who started that. Street epistemology. It's a way to help people reflect on the quality of their reasoning through civil conversation. Street epistemology gives you the tools to discuss the most difficult topics that mean a lot to you and the people around you. Helps you to better understand the views of others and maybe change a mind or two along the way. There's a lot of stuff about street epistemology, but because and this guy was a professor at some pretty far left college, and they exposed all these frauds and hoaxes. Again, instead of saying thank you for exposing this and we're going to fix this now, they attacked him. So this is Peter Boghossian. Let's see what Wikipedia has to say. I'm sure they hate him now. Actually, I think he wrote a book about Victor Stenger too, which was awesome. His areas of academic focus include atheism, critical thinking, pedagogy, scientific skepticism, and the Socratic method. He's the author of A Manual for Creating Atheists and How to Have Impossible Conversations, a very practical guide. Boghossian was involved in the grievance studies affair, also called So-Called Squared, in media coverage with collaborators James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose, which put forth intentionally preposterous ideas in peer-reviewed publications related to gender studies and other fields. This project generated significant media and academic attention, including both praise and condemnation, as well as ethical and methodological criticism. Again, you catch the thief, and they blame you for it. No, the thief is the bad person. After an investigation, Portland State University restricted Boghossian's future work on the basis of research misconduct. So, yeah, instead of, here he is, he showed, hey, this is where we're messing up. Let's fix this. No, instead they busted him. So there you go. Boghossian coined the term street epistemology for a set of conversation techniques he described, which are designed to enable an examination of strongly held beliefs, especially of the religious kind, in a non-confrontational manner. There's a guy named Anthony Magnabosco who is absolutely politically diametrically opposed to Peter Boghossian, who does zillions of videos all day long on street epistemology on YouTube. So you can see that done properly, no matter where your ideology comes from, you can use science and the scientific method and reality-based techniques to get to the truth, regardless of your political views or your feelings or whatever. Both Peter Boghossian and Anthony Magnabosco come up with we'll get the same ideas. Let's just put this in. Anthony Magnabosco. So he's got piles of these videos, street epistemology. Check them out. And so again, like I say, the beauty of this kind of thing is that regardless of your bias, regardless of where you come from, you will get the same answers, which is, that's the whole point of replication, right? Like, no matter who does the study, where the study's done on, if the study's done properly, you'll get the same results. If you don't get the same results, somebody's full of crap someplace, or somebody made a mistake, either way. Like they say, don't attribute to malice that which could be ascribed to incompetence, right? But there are a lot of cases where this is actually malice, and I'm going to go on to here and watch a little video. Now, this guy's been making a lot of videos lately, but this one especially hits hard. And I think it just came out today, 5 hours ago, yeah. This time, it's the president of Stanford University. And when I tell you, you guys are killing yourselves to get your kids into these Ivy League schools or these super prestigious schools or whatever, it doesn't matter. They're just as garbage as the whole rest of them. I mean, how many times have we nailed Harvard and Stanford for just having absolute garbage come out of there? And or Yale, Oxford, nobody's, of course, everybody makes mistakes, but just because you're a prestigious school or whatever, it doesn't mean anything. It's probably better than a diploma mill, but it's not worth paying a house worth of money over. Are you crazy? And, they need to reform their institutions. But in this case, this is the president of Stanford University that we're going to be talking about. So let me just play this on here. I really encourage you to go back to Pete Judo channel, and he's not the only one. There's piles of these videos where they catch researchers out as frauds and faking. I mean, think about how many scandals you've seen in your lifetime. Like, were you around for the Pons and Fleischmann scandal? So like the for cold fusion. See if somebody's got a video up. Basically, there's a bunch of perpetual motion machines out there. This one was a cold fusion. They're claiming from these guys. They did pretty much science by press release instead of in a peer-reviewed paper. But yeah. Anyway, so let me play this.
Another very high-profile researcher has been accused of data fraud. But this time, it's not just any researcher. It is the president of Stanford University, one of the most prestigious universities in the world. His name is Mark Tessier-Lavigne, and a few days ago, he announced that he is stepping down as president of Stanford University.
Right. As bad as this is good news. The guy, it's not as good as you'd think it would be, but at least they did something. At least they acknowledged that this guy should not be the president. Unfortunately, he's still heading all kinds of stuff, but but at least Stanford did something about this. What has Yale or Harvard or Princeton done when they get nailed with this crap? But at least they did something.
Due to these allegations that I'm going to tell you about in today's video. So in this video, I'm going to tell you what those allegations are, and more interestingly, I think, is how those allegations had to come to light. Then I'll tell you what Stanford's response was to these allegations, and then I'm going to conclude on what this tells us about the state of academia, especially at the top level. This story is even more depressing than the Francesco Gino case we talked about a few weeks ago, and
this Francesco Gino one was showing a lot of fraud in some other studies, but I don't know if you know this, but at this level, there's a lot of this publish or perish kind of nonsense, and there's tenure. Tenure is the worst. Tenure was supposed to be there to protect people from. It's to allow for viewpoint diversity. So you got a professor, and maybe they don't totally step in line with the rest of the professors politically. They're protected, and they can't be fired just for not being politically the same as everybody else. That's a good thing, but that's not what tenure is used for now. Now that college is pretty monolithic in culture, and again, there's a million studies out there you can go check out for yourself that's the truth. Tenure is just there to protect very bad professors or people who are trying to indoctrinate people in just the most awful way. It's so that they get to keep their job, and tenure is awful. Publish or perish is awful. It's causing people to force out these papers that they shouldn't. I mean, think about that Bart Ehrman one not too long ago. As much as we like Bart Ehrman, it didn't really look like he even read the stuff that he was responding to, the historicity of Jesus thing or whatever. And there was this reminds me of this. There was a young girl in college who took on C.S. Lewis back in the day, and actually, there's this doctrine around how this guy's untouchable and whatever, and it was a very young student who actually annihilated him, and that's what happens in this case too, which is actually awesome. So
the outcome of the investigation, I think, is an irreparable stain on Stanford's reputation. So buckle up, this story is sad, shocking, and depressing, but let's jump into it. So Marc Tessier-Lavigne is a neuroscientist. That means he studies nerve cells and brain tissue and neurobiology. He's most famous for his supposedly groundbreaking research in the 90s and early 2000s that discovered how the brain develops, how neurons develop, which apparently has big implications for Alzheimer's disease. So through this groundbreaking research into neuroscience, apparently a whole subfield of neuroscience study was developed, and through many years, many promotions, being put in charge of many different research labs, he's managed to work his way all the way up the academic ladder to being in one of the most prestigious positions in all of academia, president of Stanford University. And in addition to being president of the university, he's also on the board of directors for several neuroscience-based medical research companies. He's become a very
kind of a conflict of interest there, right? You're doing these studies at a university that will help your company. Kind of scary.
influential person, not only in the world of neuroscience, but in academia in general. And so anybody who wants to stand up to him and call him out on his research would be taking a massive reputational risk to themselves, as the backlash could be potentially fatal for their career. And it's probably for that reason that Marc Tessier-Lavigne had not been investigated thoroughly for so many years, despite rumors of malpractice circulating in niche academic circles for a long time. That was until, and this is the craziest part of the whole story, these allegations were formally investigated by an 18-year-old freshman at Stanford University, Theo Baker. So Theo...
Yes, and thanks to guys like this. This is balls of steel. This is like that nurse Wubbles that stood up to the police when they were trying to like illegally take blood out of a patient. And again, another young, maybe not as young, but this was the story of what was her name? Anscombe. Yeah, Elizabeth Anscombe. So C.S. Lewis, if you don't know who he is, he's kind of the father of modern apologetics, I guess. Maybe Bonson. But he was just untouchable. He's just writing all these silly papers, and everybody's eating it up. And somebody had to debate him. There was a debate coming up, and nobody wanted to do it because they didn't want to get worked by this guy. But, they kind of forced this young girl student to to do it, and she annihilated him. She wiped the floor with them. This article is called the humiliating debate that may have led C.S. Lewis to quit apologetics, but it just says, around the same time, a young and up-and-coming philosopher, Elizabeth Anscombe, arrived at Oxford. In 1948, she presented a paper in response to one of Lewis's arguments in Miracles at an Oxford group called the Socratic Club. The club had been founded in 1942 with Lewis as its first president, as an open forum for the discussion of the intellectual difficulties connected with religion and with Christianity in particular. Lewis had offered in Miracles what's called the argument from reason. So if you're into apologetics, you know this one, argument from reason, which said the naturalistic view of the world without God, in which the human mind is the result of chance, is self-defeating, since it would require rationality emerging from non-rational causes, undermining the very mechanism by which a person arrives at naturalism. Anscombe's response accused Lewis of making several important category mistakes. And so here, Lewis had, I don't know if they called it tenure back then, but he was untouchable. He was like this god among the academics, which it sounds ridiculous to us today to hear some like theologian as like well, no, actually, I mean, we still got Alvin Plantinga, right? People slather on about him all the time. But Anscombe's response accused Lewis of making several important category mistakes. I'd say category errors. Lewis's friends Sawyers and others say that the older famous Lewis lost the debate to the young, unknown at that time Anscombe, forcing him to rewrite Miracles in a future printing. The public loss was so humiliating, they claimed, that it shook Lewis's confidence in doing apologetics, so he turned to writing fiction instead, focusing on his Narnia series for the next decade. So it's funny that we might be able to, if you like Chronicles of Narnia, the Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe, all that stuff, you may have to thank Anscombe for whacking this guy, and he had to go into writing fiction. Some of us would say he'd been writing fiction all along, but that's a whole nother thing. Anyway, so this is another young guy took on the establishment and absolutely, for our benefit, wiped the floor with them, which is absolutely awesome. So let's go on here.
Theo Baker has got to be the biggest badass of this whole story. Theo Baker is an 18-year-old freshman at Stanford University, and he's also part of the Stanford Daily newspaper, which is a student-run newspaper where all of the journalists are working for free, including Theo. So Theo Baker took it upon himself to go and reach out to somebody else called Elizabeth Bick. Now, Elizabeth Bick is a biologist, but she's also a scientific fraud investigator, which made her a perfect person to investigate Mark Tessier's work for cases of fraud. So Theo Baker got in contact with her, and she agreed to look into his work to see if there's any malpractice going on. And she sure as hell found some malpractice. So I'm going to explain Elizabeth Bick's findings to you now. Warning.
All right, so again, here's another super badass, Elizabeth Bick. Born 1966, Dutch microbiologist and scientific integrity consultant. She nails these people from time to time. It's really cool that she actually would go after somebody so high profile. A lot of these people are terrified of people at this level academia, but she did it. That is just absolutely awesome.
Things are going to get a little bit technical because this is neuroscience research, but I'm going to explain it in as simple a way as I possibly can. All of these allegations were originally reported on by Theo Baker in his original Stanford Daily article, which was published in November 2022. So if you want to read that article in full, I'll have a link to it in the description.
So can you imagine, this guy staked his whole life and all this money, all this scholarship, all his whole future, publishing an article critical of his university's president in the university's newspaper. That is balls of steel. This is the kind of people we need.
But let's jump into the allegations. So many of the allegations of data fraud relate to these blots. And don't those blots look fishy to you? Just kidding. For 99.9% of you watching this video, you have no idea what you're looking at, and that's not me disparaging you. When I saw these blots, I had no idea what I was looking at either. But I've spent every hour of my free time over the last 3 days to try and figure out what these blots actually mean, so here's what I found. So these blots are a result of a technique in biological science called Western blot. And it's a pretty complicated multi-step process, but you can kind of think of it as chromatography for proteins. So if I take you back to middle school chemistry class, chromatography is when you put a little blob of ink on a piece of paper, you dip the bottom of that paper in some shallow water, and as that water travels up the paper, the ink dissolves in the water, and the more soluble elements of that ink travel further, and the less soluble ones get left further behind. And as a result, you get this beautiful pattern where all the different components of the ink are separated by solubility, which allows you to see what the different components of the ink actually are. In the case of Western blot, they're basically doing the same thing, but for proteins. So in the case of Marc Tessier-Lavine's research, he's taking a little bit of mouse neuron, maybe sliced up a little bit of brain or something, dissolved it in a solution, put it into one of these machines, and what happens is that as the solution trickles down the membrane of the machine, the heavier proteins get left at the top and the lighter proteins filter down to the bottom, which allows you to see all the different proteins that exist in that solution. And what Marc Tessier-Lavine is testing for are specific proteins in this solution in order to prove his hypothesis. And at a very high level, the way that you read these blots is that the thicker and darker the blots are, the higher the concentration of the protein. And if there's no line at all, that means that that protein isn't present in your sample. So that is a very high level explanation for how Western blot works. If you want a more in-depth explanation, I highly recommend Emma Sandy's video, link in the description. She's a Scottish PhD student and she has the best video on how Western blot works that I could find on the internet. Thank you, Emma Sandy, for your amazing video. Anyway, back to the allegations. So these blots are supposed to represent the results of his manipulation, right? He's trying to show how FAC and PERC change the concentration of proteins in the mouse neuron. Don't ask me what FAC and PERC mean, I have absolutely no clue, but as you can see, the image, the results of his testing are exactly the same. And now you know that this is a kind of protein chromatography, it seems pretty unlikely that you would get exactly the same pattern of lines with two different manipulations. It's not just unlikely, in fact, it is impossible for that to be the case. So clearly, at the very least, there's been some false reporting here as to the results of their study. That could be an accident just when they were putting the paper together, but nevertheless, it's sloppy and should have been called out. So this
is the thing, like, like you say, they say never attribute to malice that which can be ascribed to incompetence. I don't know how much I would like to really stick with that, but it's definitely something to consider. And if you automatically assume that, you won't be falsely accusing people of stuff, at least. But yeah, I think after a while you know which side of the bread the butter is on, right?
This blot manipulation was taken from a 2008 study from Marc Tessier-Lavine, but there was other papers that involved blots as well, like for example this 2001 paper, and this one, in my opinion, is even more egregious. So as you can see in this one, the way that the blots were published in the paper is kind of weird. They're like weirdly low resolution, it's a very blurry photo, and also if you look carefully, you can see some odd artifacts in the imagery. There are some strange straight lines here and here. So Elizabeth Bick, who was approached by Theo Baker, took this image and all she did was simply turn up the contrast. And when you turn up the contrast, this is the result. Now with the contrast turned up, we can see very clearly what is actually going on. For example, these two yellow squares are exactly the same, and the green squares are also exactly the same, which suggests that somebody has gone into this photo and done a bit of Photoshop and is trying to hide something behind those squares. So that's where those weird, strange edges come from, and the most suspicious part to me is the fact that when they publish the paper, they deliberately have blurred the photo to try and make this manipulation of the photo less obvious, and they didn't declare it anywhere in the original paper. Now, Stanford University came forward and put out a statement saying that these mistakes do not affect the results or the interpretation of the results in the study. That's kind of not very reassuring to me as somebody who wants to trust in this kind of research, right? There's clearly been some effort here to manipulate the results, to mislead the people reading the paper. If it doesn't affect the results, that's fine, but it should be declared in the paper if that's the case. Why is there all this kind of suspicious behind the scenes manipulation trying to trick people into thinking that this is the original photo when it's clearly not? Not very convincing to me. A very similar situation with these ink blots as well. These are taken from the same 2001 paper. As you can see, the photo is very blurry, Elizabeth Bick turns up the contrast. This is the result. If you look at the top right, the blue rectangle on the left is the same as the blue rectangle on the right, except that the one on the right has been flipped upside down. And the red rectangles are literally exactly the same. So again, another clear example of image manipulation. And to me, and again, this wasn't called out in the original Stanford Daily article, but if you look at the top left panel, there's clearly some weird visual artifacts going on here as well. There seems to be some sort of pasted image here on the right. And same for the one in the bottom right as well. Like, why is the texture weirdly blurry at the top here? Clearly looks like some sort of image manipulation. So not all of the allegations are related to inkblot. Some of them are just photos that he's manipulated. If you look at these results, this is from a 2003 paper from Marc Tessier-Lavigne. Each row is supposed to show a different brain, but as you can clearly see, the second and the third row are actually showing the exact same brain, just rotated. The parts of the photo in the red squares are literally exactly the same, so clearly it's the same brain. So again, to me, this manipulation is like really suspicious. Why are they rotating the photo? Is that to try and hide the fact that they've used the same photo twice? It just seems really dodgy, and it's definitely malpractice. And this last one is probably the most comically obvious example of data fraud out of all of the allegations we've seen so far. You don't need any training in neuroscience to see that this is clearly data fraud. This is the original figure that was published in that 2001 paper, the same one that some of those inkblots came from. And what they're trying to say here is that after an hour, this neuron has grown. But if you just look at the little, visual artifacts around the slide, you can clearly see that this is just the same photo zoomed in a bit. And the neuron hasn't grown at all, but guess what? When you zoom into things, they get larger.
Yeah, at this point, was this an accident or was this actually fraud? Like, if a student did this, there's no question they would be fried over this. And it wouldn't be assumed that it was an accident. It would be assumed that this was fraud. But because this is the president of Stanford, it's all good.
I mean, if you thought the Francesca Gino data fraud was basic, this is comically simplistic, right? You're literally playing spot the difference. I think a 5-year-old could tell you that these two photos are actually the same. So that's just a sample of the allegations being brought against Marc Tessier-Lavigne, and these were presented 8 months ago by Theo Baker's article in November 2022. So what has happened in the 8 months since? Well, since then, there's been an investigation into Marc Tessier-Lavigne's work carried out by law firm Kirkland and Ellis. Gotta love Kirkland brand investigators, am I right? So, in Kirkland and Ellis's investigation, there were a total of 12 papers that they were looking into that were deemed suspicious. 7 of them, Marc Tessier-Lavigne was a co-author on the paper, but not the primary author. But for 5 of them, he was the primary author. And the conclusion to the report is perhaps the most baffling thing to me. In more legal language than this, they basically say that Marc Tessier-Lavigne wasn't the one who did it. He wasn't aware of someone else in his lab doing it. It was some goon in his lab who did it without his knowledge. And the report even goes on to say that he wasn't being reckless in not checking the work before it was published.
No, you check your work. You're the name on it. You check the work. This is passing the buck stuff. Luckily, in the music business, right, you got the producer. And it's all on him. You can't blame the band. You can't blame the engineer. Can't blame the studio. Can't blame anybody. Producer is it. You didn't get it right. It's you. It's the producer.
And I have no idea how you can possibly come to that conclusion when he's the primary author on this paper. If my name is going to be the primary author on this supposedly groundbreaking piece of neuroscience research, I'm going to be checking that paper multiple times before it goes to publication. And you're telling me that Marc Tessier-Lavigne didn't check through his own paper once? He didn't look at this diagram once and think that something looked fishy here? Come on. That being said though, the report does go on to say that Tessier-Lavigne's labs do seem to have an unusual frequency of manipulation of research data and or substandard scientific practices from different people at different times and in labs at different situations, which suggests that there may have been opportunities to improve laboratory oversight and management. And what that says to me is that Marc Tessier-Lavigne is just totally corrupt. He basically has a long history of, at the very least, turning a blind eye to poor scientific practices in his lab across a long career, and he's continued to be happy to turn that blind eye as long as the checks keep rolling in. Speaking of checks, guess how much Marc Tessier-Lavigne makes per year? According to research by the Stanford Daily, in 2021, he earned $1.5 million in his role for being president of Stanford, and an additional $700,000 for being on the board of directors for Regeneron, one of his biotech medical research companies. $2.2 million per year. I'd take that. It's pretty good. Doesn't hurt. So, as you can see, turning a blind eye to poor research practices in your lab pays pretty nice. But here's the part that pains me the most. So because the Kirkland and Ellis investigation concluded that he wasn't aware and didn't do the manipulation himself, he wasn't forced to resign by Stanford. Instead, he's voluntarily stepped down, saying that the president of Stanford shouldn't have these kind of conversations around them. It's not good for the university. So he's stepping down as president, but he wasn't even fired by the board. Instead, he's going to continue being a faculty member of Stanford University and still continue to be allowed to run his labs. And I don't know how Stanford can hold their head up high as a legitimate scientific institution when they're letting somebody who has a clear track record of letting their labs have poor research practices continue to run a lab even after all of this comes to light.
Unbelievable. Imagine if that was a student that did this. Imagine if this was a person who they didn't agree with politically who did this. There's no way you would leave this guy in charge. So again, parents, this is where you guys are putting your kids into debt for the rest of their lives. And you know, especially with like the micromanaged kids, like you just taking away all their childhood and stuff so they can go and suck up to one of these frauds. You know, it's absolutely nuts.
You're basically letting a guy who's proven to be corrupt continue to run corrupt labs and produce poor results. Like, it's absolutely baffling to me that this guy isn't fired. And not only is he allowed to continue running his lab, but as far as I can tell, he is still on the board of directors for Regeneron, making that very healthy $700,000 a year. So at the end of the Francesca Gino video I did last month, I had a sympathetic note for Francesca Gino, but absolutely no sympathy for you, Mark. You seem to be doing just fine despite all of these allegations. So what are my closing thoughts? In addition to all the points that we already made in the Francesca Gino video about the publish or perish culture that academia seems to breed, this also reveals something new, which is the fact that harder sciences are also just as open to fraud as the soft sciences, like behavioral.
Well, again, okay, so I'm going to say that the reason the harder sciences are just as open to fraud as the softer sciences, first of all, because, again, journals don't like to publish replications. They should. I mean, like I say, I would love to have a journal that's all we do. We could make an online journal, make it a lot easier to do. And imagine like really fun kind of science experiments that you could do in school that, you know, you already know the results of, but the kids are replicating it themselves. Not only are they replicating it so that they can see the same results, but you can also use it as a learning experience to see what you could be doing wrong. And that's how you know, that's why you're doing this experiment yourself, is to see if you even get the same results. Even if you know the results are right, you can still get a lot of things wrong. And that's a really good thing to fix. And this is like, again, you know, having this young girl who took on C.S. Lewis. You know, there's still plenty of people who read his stuff for apologetics, but that pretty much ended his what they call sophisticated theology back in the day. And again, like, you know, we probably wouldn't have The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe had he not gotten decimated by her, you know. And this guy, 18-year-old or freshman, whatever he was, a freshman, stood up to the president of Stanford and called him out. You know, this is huge. I would love to see more of this stuff, but I'm going to say you can't just say that this is just as common in the real sciences as in the pseudosciences and soft sciences, because right now the soft sciences and pseudosciences are the gatekeepers for the hard sciences, and that's a problem. They should have nothing to do with it. Feelings got nothing to do with science or math or any other reality-based study. And I don't think that had this guy not been part of the dominant culture at Stanford, I don't think he could have gotten away with this fraud for so long. I think he would have gotten nailed a long time ago. And this is why we need actual bias-free stuff, not calling it bias-free, but just having a different bias.
Science. That was one of the most common comments I got in the Francesca Gino video, people saying that this thing wouldn't happen in a hard science. This is neuroscience, medical science, and here we are looking at data fraud at a very high status level.
But again, Francesca Gino's, Yeah, and that's why, because she was into soft science. But again, it's gate kept by the soft sciences. And I hate calling it soft science because it's not science; it's garbage. And if they're the gatekeepers of real science, you're going to end up with stuff like this. There's no way this study would have gotten through had this guy not been who he was, or had he not had the viewpoints that he has.
Because something has physical evidence doesn't mean that fraud isn't possible. It's certainly possible. And this should also silence any of the academics who were claiming that the Francesca Gino video was a win. Not only was Mark Tessier-Levine not called out by the standard peer review process, but he had to be called out 20 years later by an 18-year-old freshman at his local university newspaper. Full props to Theo for being extremely courageous and bringing this story forward, but it's absolutely ridiculous that he had to do that. Like, this should have been caught years ago by the academic system, and it simply wasn't.
But again, the academic system is absolutely broken. The idea that you got to spend 3/4 of your money, 3/4 of your time, 3/4 of your work, 3/4 of your homework and paper writing and all this other crap in order to learn, in scare quotes, stuff that has nothing to do with your actual degree. This is why this stuff happens. We got to get rid of it.
But what do you think of Mark Tessier-Levine's story? Do you think my conclusions are fair or not? Let me know in the comments below. I promise you guys I'm going to be making more uplifting videos in a few weeks. I already have done an interview with an amazing behavioral scientist who I think is doing incredible, robust, positive work that's helping the world. So stay tuned for that. Subscribe if you want to get that positive content. But for now, it's just all scandal.
So really, I would, if you're at all interested in this stuff, take a look at Pete Judo's channel, and he's, especially the Francesca Gino stuff, but I don't want to pick on her. I mean, this happens all the time. Think about the biggest ones we saw in our lives, right? They want to support this particular viewpoint, and I'll just say it. Elizabeth Holmes, right? Theranos. Nobody with a functioning brain believed a word this lady said. Nobody. And yet she had all these like Pentagon guys and high level like congressmen and all these media shills all sucking up and like made this big deal about Theranos and wasn't Obama or somebody was like calling her one of the smartest women, like they gave her some award or something. Like all these idiots fell for this nonsense, but anybody with 2 brain cells to rub together saw that and was like, no way. No way. You don't just come on here and just start talking like you're, we got, what's the thing in our industry? The neural DSP quad cortex, right? This guy claimed, oh yeah, nobody knows what they're doing. We're going to show everybody how to do it right. They still haven't even put in the stuff they promised at launch. Oh, yeah. So Jordan Peterson did an interview with the person who went out with the intention to totally commit fraud on the academic papers. Yeah. So that was probably Peter Boghossian. And so we talked about that earlier on with the so-called squared hoax. That's the grievance studies affair. That was, I think it was James Lindsay, Peter Boghossian, and Helen Pluckrose. And remember, Peter Boghossian is the father of modern epistemology. He's the street epistemology guy. And, Instead of saying thank you, you exposed the problems in our system, they censored him. And just like what happened to Alan Sokol when he proved how crap this stuff was. So yeah, please don't put your kids into debt for the rest of their lives just to suck up to these frauds, right? Anyways, I got to go fix junk and